All right, welcome everybody. Sorry for the delay. We've been having some technical issues with StreamYard going with all of this, but welcome everybody. I'm John Buck. I'm hosting for Converse Contender. We're going to be doing a debate today between Dry Apologist and Ben Watkins from A Theology channel. And the topic is divine hiddenness and the problem of evil. I believe that Ben is going to start, and it'll probably he'll make his case. I don't think we'll have any sort of exact time limit exactly, but and then we'll kind of move on from there, and then we'll be also taking questions as well. So Ben, if you want to take it away. Oops. Oh, there we go. Sorry. No. Shoot. Okay, there. Now it's focused on him, right? Yeah.
Okay, so everyone can hear me?
Yeah.
Just fine. Okay, cool. So I'll start off with the problem of evil first, and then I'll go into the problem of divine hiddenness. So to start off with the problem of evil, an important question raised by our experiences of suffering and other circumstances of injustice is whether or not the world contains undesirable states of affairs that count against our believing there exists a perfect being such as God. Can we reconcile what we know about the kinds, amounts, and distributions of evil in the world with the existence of a being who has the knowledge, power, and motivation to do something about it? This question goes back to at least the Greek philosopher Epicurus. He's famous for saying, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then from whence comes evil? And so philosophers have been kind of wrestling with this problem ever since. But why is this important? What if God is not omnipotent or is malevolent? In order to answer that question, I'll first have to maybe take a little side note and just kind of discuss the concept of God that's in play here, just so that we're all on the same page. And so I think there's at least two very important ways of conceiving what a God is in the traditional Western monotheistic sense. And so the first way is God is a supernatural agent. So according to what I'll call the supernatural agent thesis, God is a single disembodied mind that causally interacts with the natural world. And so a supernatural agent is supernatural in the sense of being a disembodied mind or being, and an agent in the sense of having a rational mind that can have thoughts, make choices between alternatives, and perform other intentional actions. So examples of other possible supernatural agents we can think of would be things like angels and demons, minor deities such as Satan or Brahma from polytheistic traditions such as Hinduism, ghosts and poltergeists, the designer god of intelligent design, or deism more generally, or just as souls. We generally in Western tradition, souls are thought of as disembodied minds. And so the second way to conceive of God, that's the most important way for the argument for the problem of evil, is the perfect being thesis. And according to which God is a perfect impersonal being who is always worthy of our worship. And so such a being would have essential divine properties of infinite power, perfect knowledge, perfect goodness, and perfect love. And so with that in mind, we now have the conceptual tools to lay out the core argument from evil, which is basically just the first premise is theism implies there are no unjustified evils. The second premise is there are some unjustified evils. And so therefore the conclusion is theism is false. So this core argument turns on the existence of unjustified evils, which requires a further subsidiary argument. And so that further subsidiary argument is going to involve both substantial moral and non-moral factual claims. But before I get too far into that, what is an unjustified evil? So some state of affairs is evil if it is intrinsically undesirable in a reason-implying sense. In other words, we would all have reason to want to avoid the state of affairs from obtaining. An unjustified evil is one a perfect being could have prevented and would not have been justified in not doing so. A perfect being could prevent injustices of intense suffering by intervening because an infinitely powerful being would have the power to intervene. A perfectly good being would be maximally motivated to intervene, and an all-knowing being would truly believe whether some instances of intense suffering would occur unless he intervened. And so this is the justification for our first premise, that theism implies there are no unjustified evils. So the second premise is what the argument really turns on, is the existence of unjustified evils. Are there any unjustified evils in the world? And so to me, at least, I think the answer seems obviously yes, but that's not good enough. We need further argument. So when we reflect on circumstances of injustice in our world, we quickly realize our world is full of suffering and the distribution of it appears mostly random. For example, there are circumstances of injustice involving the intense suffering of creatures that are morally innocent. So examples that come to mind are human infants with terminal diseases, non-human animals who languish in the state of nature through a process of biological evolution. And some people suffer so horrendously they come to believe their lives are, on the whole, not worth living. So if we take these moral judgments at face value, still isn't sufficient to answer our question. We can't just say these are unjustified evils. We need some further subsidiary argument. We must explain why these sorts of evils have the property of being unjustified, and thus count against our believing God exists. This is essentially an ethical question and will necessarily involve an appeal to moral principles about goodness and badness, or rightness and wrongness. I won't get too deep into that right now. I'll save that for later discussion. But basically, what I'll say for now is that we can have axiological ways of trying to cash out this premise, which basically tries to say that, yes, there are unjustified evils, and we make this case in terms of goodness and badness. Or we can do this in a deontological way, where we try to cash out the defense of this premise in terms of rightness and wrongness. And so now I want to shift my attention to the problem of divine hiddenness, and I'll try to keep this one as brief as I can, because I think the argument from divine hiddenness is, in a very important sense, a variation of the problem of evil. It just, instead of being within the practical domain of ethics, it's within the epistemic domain of ethics. And so an important epistemic question raised by the reality of non-theists is whether or not God is sufficiently obvious enough for us to rationally believe he exists. If such non-theism is rational, then is such non-resistant non-theism compatible with a perfectly loving God? Well, before I go any further, what do I mean by a non-resistant non-theist? For some non-theists, myself included, the God of theism can seem indifferent, distant, silent, or in some way hidden. Some people come to no longer believe or never have believed there is a perfect being, and this lack of belief or absence of belief is not the result of emotional or behavioral oppositional towards God, or any behavioral opposition in which they would be culpable for. And so the argument is, again, very simple, much like the argument from evil. First premise is theism implies there are no non-resistant non-theists. Second premise is there are some non-resistant non-theists. So the conclusion is theism is false. So the first premise, theism implies there are no non-resistant non-theists, is based on the idea of the relationship between God's perfect love and his openness to relationship. So the most core claim to the hiddenness argument is that God's perfect love implies he would always be open to a relationship. If God is always open to a relationship, then every finite person believes God exists unless they are somehow resisting such a belief. Because a belief that God exists is a necessary condition for a meaningful relationship. It cannot be the case that I am in a relationship with someone unless I also believe that they exist. So that justifies our first premise if we also accept the claim that nothing that God would do on his part would ever put relationship with one of his creatures out of reach. They would be able to have a relationship just by trying. The metaphor that I really like is that God would always be like a light for everyone that would, no matter how much the dimness fluctuated, would always remain on unless you closed your eyes. And so the closing of the eyes would be the metaphor for resistance, some sort of resistance to a belief in God. And so the second premise is there are some non-resistant non-theists. Former theists, again, like myself, were already in a relationship with God, and a loss of belief has terminated that relationship. Lifelong seekers are open to finding or being found by a perfect being without ever achieving that goal. Isolated non-theists have never even been in a position to resist belief because they've never even had the idea of a perfect being. As an implication, isolated non-theists unavoidably live their entire lives within the influence of a fundamentally misleading system of religious meaning. So again, if we accept there are these non-resistant non-theists, then it follows that theism is false. And so those respective are the problems of evil and the problems of hiddenness.
All right, so I guess I'm going to respond now. I don't know if I can't hear John. Can you hear me, Ben?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, I'll go ahead and just respond then. So, yeah, with the problems of evil and problem of hiddenness, so you focused on unjustified evils, which I take, maybe you gave a formal definition of that, but I take that to mean like evils that don't have some sort of direct compensating goods for them. Would that be fair enough?
So I would say that is fair enough if we are, again, I didn't go into this specifically, but maybe now is a good time to go into it. If we're talking about it in axiological terms. So if we're saying that what matters is what happens to you, then yes. But there are other ways to cash this out. If we think that what matters morally is how we respond to what happens to us, so like in a deontological sense, that's another way of cashing out unjustified evils. Perhaps there are ways that are just categorically wrong for a perfect being to treat us. So, for example, I think that it would be categorically wrong for a perfect being to torture us for eternity. I think it would be categorically wrong for a being to treat us in that way, regardless of what sort of consequences might come of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And then non-resistant non-believers, I think I got you there. So people who are open to relation with God, but aren't able to form that relation because they lack the necessary belief. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, and a lot of times when theists respond to these arguments, they question the idea that there are non-resistant non-believers or that there are unjustified evils. And I would actually, at least in a qualified sense with the unjustified evils, I'd be willing to grant that while we can't definitively prove that there are those things, I would be willing to grant it because it does seem pretty intuitively obvious.
You'd be willing to agree to just for the sake of argument's sake.
Well, I agree with it. I just recognize I can't definitively prove it, but I think that it is the more reasonable position to hold that there are. But why I want to qualify unjustified evils is it depends upon what we mean. If it's ultimately unjustified, that's what I'm not going to agree with because I'm going to say that God has a justification. But what I agree with is in the sense that I think there are some evils that, maybe this is where I would I had a certain idea in mind. There are certain evils that don't lead to a compensating good, and so that was how I was imagining it. But if you mean ultimately unjustified, that's where I would disagree.
Gotcha.
So, well, anyways, a lot of times theists will say, well, there's some compensating
That's
good
fair.
for every evil that occurs, and I don't agree with that approach. I think somebody could argue it, it's not very plausible. So oftentimes appealing to like greater good type approaches. So I take a different approach, which if you watch my video on it, you're going to be roughly familiar. But so this idea that God can't force beings into a relation with him. So oftentimes that's argued with like a free will approach. So somebody would argue, well, there's moral evil. And one of the ideas would be because God can't force somebody's will to be good. They have to have that freedom. And I think that's plausible in regards to why God would allow people to be able to will evil. But I don't think it explains natural evil or why God would allow people to carry out evils. And also it doesn't explain non-resistant non-believers in regards to hiddenness. So what I want to do, I call this the perfect will theodicy. I sort of expand that notion. So this draws upon like kind of what Thomas Ord argues, although I argue it differently. But I expand this sort of idea of force and argue that, well, if the heavenly state is the state where people are in perfect relation with God, and that's ultimately of the perfect state, then that's going to be a reality where everything acts in accordance with God's will and his intellect, so as they work together. So his will and his intellect, that's the ultimate perfect state.
Necessarily? I'm sorry, I'm interrupting.
Oh, it's fine.
You're saying that the agents' wills in heaven will necessarily be in accordance with God's will or God's intentions.
Morally speaking, yeah. Yeah,
okay.
So
it's important for if we get deep into free will. Sorry to interrupt.
Right.
Go ahead.
So anyways, so that's going to be a reality where there's no natural or moral natural or moral evils, because everything's operating in perfect accordance with God's will, is my argument. But since God can't justifiably, according to his moral nature, I'm arguing, he can't justifiably force beings into that relation. He has to start them out in a different kind of state, which I call the pre-heavenly universe or pre-heavenly state. And that state isn't in perfect accordance with God's intellect and will. It's not in a perfect relation. So things, while they operate somewhat accordance with his plan, they don't operate in perfect accordance. So there are going to be events that don't manifest in compensating goods within this life. And there are going to be people that are striving to believe in God, but aren't able to for whatever reason. And to me, that accounts for, or could plausibly account for, natural evils, why people are able to carry out crimes, why there would be non-resistant non-believers. So it's not that all these things manifest in some particular good reason. It's rather there's the overall justification is that God wants to bring people into relation with him, but he can't force that relation. So that's how I respond to that.
So would it be fair to say, so I see an overarching question here being, why would a perfect being create anything less than a perfect world? And so it seems like your answer to that question is because it's, for whatever reason, not within God's power. I don't want to put words in your mouth, fill it in wherever you want to here. It's not within his power to just make a world like that, because if he were to do that, he would then have to force people to come into a relationship with him. And so
I would say, with the power term, I would say that he can't do things that would conflict with his moral nature. So while he does have the
power to conflict with his moral nature, but that doesn't count against his omnipotence.
Right.
That'd be the best. Okay. That's fair.
Kind of like how theists often argue God can't lie, and it's not because he literally can't speak certain words or communicate certain ideas. It's because it would conflict with his moral nature.
Gotcha. So this would be the explanation of why there are these things like apparent unjustified evils. So while they might be unjustified in the sense of compensating goods, they're not ultimately unjustified.
Right. So like I would call like particular goods might be absent. Like if somebody says like, well, why did, this event happen? And somebody might say, well, it was so this person could realize this or something in this life. And I would say, no, there probably is gratuitous evils within this life, but it has an overarching greater good of, building towards the relation with God. Not that it's needed for that relation, but it's, the stage, it's sort of the stepping stone to get to the heavenly world or relation.
Gotcha. Okay, so one question so it's logically possible for someone to freely choose relationship with God. So it's logically possible for two people to freely choose a relationship with God, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So is it plausible to then say it's not possible for an omnipotent God to build a world, to create a world in which everyone freely chooses a relationship with him from the outset?
So is this kind of like, are you thinking of like the Alvin Plantinga type discussion? Like,
so I maybe I don't know which discussion you're. So this is the objection that I'm thinking of from J.L. Mackie,
right?
In The Miracle of Theism, where he's saying, look, it's logic. God, the omnipotence is only limited by logical possibility. So it's logically possible for everyone, for there is some possible world in which everybody freely chooses a relationship with God. So then the question becomes, why didn't God build that obviously better world? That's what I'm driving at, but I was trying to language that related a little bit more to our discussion.
Yeah, I would say that it's not possible if that entails forcing people into the relation. So we can imagine a world in which everybody enters a relation with God, but it wouldn't be possible, right, freely, but it wouldn't be possible for that world to come about in a coercive sense. I mean, it's logically possible, but it's not something God could feasibly do because it would conflict with his nature. So it's something that's not incoherent, but if it involves force, I would say it's broadly impossible given God's nature.
So there's this distinction. You use the word feasible. So it's not that it's logically incoherent such that it wouldn't count against his omnipotence. It's that the feasibility of it is such that is infeasibility a word?
Possibly.
Anyway, it's not important. The just sounds so weird. The infeasibility of it doesn't count against his omnipotence. That's what I'm trying to say. I missed that question. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I get what you're saying. So yeah, I would argue that while there are certain things God can't do because they're logically incoherent, like make 1 + 1 = 3, there are also things that he couldn't morally do. And the world in which everybody is forced to enter a relation with him would be something he can't morally bring about. And that's the only type of world in which everybody would come into relation. But even if you were to argue, like Mackie and some have suggested, well, God could give us like compatibilist freedom, I would be fine with that. So I don't think that maybe this theodicy is, but I don't think it actually requires libertarian free will if one works with the compatibilist notion of it would be still wrong for an agent to force another agent. So like if I say I have compatibilist freedom and you do too, it would still be wrong for me to force you to do something. So if God, if we really do live in a reality in which we all have compatibilist freedom, it's still morally wrong for God to force relationships. So I don't know if that helps the argument, but I feel like it's
so I was trying, because I hear what you're saying with the compatibilist freedom thing, but I was trying not to press that one just yet to try to stay within the realm of libertarian freedom, because what's significant freedom is what I wanted to try to concede, right here for the sake of argument. We're saying that it's logically possible for one person to in a significant free sense, choose relationship with God. There's no contradiction involved in that. And there's no contradiction involved with two people doing that. And there's no contradiction involved with three people, et cetera, et cetera. So then we say there's no contradiction in everybody with significantly free will, freely choosing to be in a relationship with God. And I'll even, grant the Molinists their middle knowledge here. God could see this possible world where everyone freely chooses a loving relationship with us. So then the question is, why doesn't he create that world? And so the response can't be, because God can't force anyone. Granted, the possibility assumes significant freedom. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, I get what you're saying. So, excuse me. One, I mean, I agree that Molinism helps that response, but I actually wouldn't go. I'm not convinced of Molinism, but I guess we can table that.
I'm trying to steel man the position here.
But the Molinism might be helping your objection more here. But we'll just set it aside for a second.
Sure.
Even if it's possible for God, here's the thing, and it's logically coherent to think of a reality in which everybody freely chooses God, but I think God would still be justified in creating agents who may never freely choose him. But let's table that too. That type of world, though, still would be a world in which people start out not in perfect relation with God. And it's that type of world where people aren't in perfect relation with God is the type of world that I'm arguing doesn't perfectly conform to God's will. So even if this is the type of world in which everybody comes into relation with God, it's still going to be a type of world that has imperfections within the natural world, I'm arguing.
Gotcha. And so this response is also, you've probably already said this, but it's unjustified evil and non-resistant non-believers. This is meant to explain both in a plausible sense. This isn't just specific to the problem as a solution to the problem of evil or as a solution to the problem of hiddenness, right?
Right. I look at the problem of hiddenness as a subset of natural evil, because if there are non-resistant non-believers, then at least under the theistic worldview, something's not working right with the relation with God, or something's not being communicated properly. There's some message not going through. So I look at it as a natural evil.
I think that's a fair way of thinking about it, because I think of it as just another form of the problem of evil. Just the problem of evil happens to do with the practical domain, where we're talking about actions and whatnot in the normative sense, and what would be right or wrong or justified or unjustified. And the hiddenness argument is about it's about normative belief. What would be rational or non-rational for someone to believe, and whether that would be good or bad given a perfectly loving being. And so it's the same ways of reasoning, just in different domains of the normative realm. So that was your first theodicy. You had other, did you?
Yeah, we can talk about some others. That's the one I endorse. So that's the one I've kind of come up with.
That's your own monster.
Yeah. Right? That's the one I find to be the reason why I came up with it is because I wasn't satisfied with the others. But if we want to talk about some others, that could be interesting as well, because I think it's helpful to kind of deconstruct them. If you want to go through those.
Yeah, I think that'd be really good to do.
All right, sure. So maybe we could talk about, so I talked about the free will defense a little, and so I kind of look at my theodicy as kind of subsuming the free will defense. It's kind of, the free will defense is adequate for part of a theodicy. I don't think it solves everything. Of course, some have suggested, like fallen angels could account for natural evils, and that has some problems, of course, of like
smacks of ad hocness.
Well, I think the bigger problem is because, I mean, within the theistic worldview, it makes sense, at least the certain kinds of Christian worldview, but it just raises the obvious question, why would God give them angels that kind of power when we don't have that kind of power? It just, because I've defended this theodicy in the past, but I just, that objection just is hard to get around. So.
No, I know what you. I know what you mean. I've definitely wrestled with the objection myself.
Yeah, because I mean, there is a way around it. Like, it seems empirically falsified, but the way that I think it can be defended is it's like if an earthquake occurs, it's not plausible to think, or like, there's a tornado in the middle of the United States. I'm wondering, will the angels only have access to that part of the country, or, but it could be. One could argue that that God gave some law creating powers to the angels, but it raises the question, why would he do that? So
yeah, I'm with you.
So that theodicy, to me, it's got to get around that. And you can argue it, but it's just, I thought, well, maybe God has this obligation to give him that kind of power, but the fact that we don't have that kind of power, it just seems inconsistent. So I'm not as big on that. And then, soul building is probably the most popular theodicy that I find apologists arguing. And that would probably be my next theodicy that I would defend if mine, turns out to fail. But there's several difficulties with soul building, and I don't know, maybe I should let you present some before, unless you want to hear my thoughts.
No, you're fine. So going back to the free will theodicy and then moving into, that'll help segue into soul building some. The free will theodicy often assumes the libertarian account or incompatibilist account of freedom that we mentioned earlier. And so then the obvious objection is there's the competing compatibilist account. So like, I'm a compatibilist about free will. So it seems to me that if compatibilism is true, then there is nothing incoherent with saying that God could create free beings that always freely choose rightly, or in the ways that make things go best. And so do you see so I see it as you have to have the incompatibilist conception of free will for that theodicy. Otherwise, if you take the compatibilist route, that option is just not available to you. There's no way out. Do you agree with that more or less, or where do you stand on that debate?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I hold the libertarian free will pretty adamantly, but I can understand where the compatibilist is coming from. So I would say with the free will defense on its own, that would be an objection. But the way I think I'm utilizing it within the perfect will theodicy, I still think it's compatible with compatibilism because of the, again, that issue with the relations and such. But yeah, with free will defenses, I agree that compatibilism would
for any viewers, just to make sure we're not being cursed by our knowledge here. What we mean is that there's a notion of freedom, or this notion of could have done otherwise, and is this notion compatible with causal determinism or not? And so one camp is the incompatibilists and the other camp is the compatibilists. And within the incompatibilist camp, there's the libertarian free will defenders and then the hard determinists. And so this issue is a rabbit hole in and of itself, so I won't get too far in there, but at least that'll give enough background to where what we just said makes some sense. Yeah. And so then moving into soul building, because that's actually my preferred theodicy when I think about the problem of evil in particular. So as a philosopher of religion, one of the things that what would my view look like if I changed my mind? Have that kind of already built model there for when that, religious experience comes around and tips me in the other camp, you know what I mean? Have something ready and built to go. And I don't see a way out of the problem of evil without, one, the soul building theodicy, and then two, a universalist conception of heaven, where people who suffer horrendously in this world at least get something in the next life. To me, I just don't see any other way out of the problem than that. And so the soul building theodicy in particular is saying that there has to be certain hardships that we might perceive as evil, but are necessary for character growth. So something like the virtue of courage isn't going to have any moral worth in a world without fear. And there isn't going to be a world without fear unless there's danger. And there's not going to be danger unless there's evil. And so it's a pretty plausible chain of reasoning here that's why these hardships exist. So if you think, like I do, if you think that what matters is what happens to you, then I don't think there's any way out of this. If that's what you think matters morally, there's no way out of this. If you think that what matters morally is how you respond to the things that happen to you, that's where soul building comes into play. This is saying that what matters is the character that you're developing because of the hardships that you're facing. Yes, these are really, really bad states of affairs, but they have to be there in order to develop these morally significant character virtues. So that's how I see the soul building theodicy. Do you more or less see it in the same way or similar?
Yeah, maybe if that's your go-to theodicy when you convert, I shouldn't try to knock it down here. But,
Fair enough.
Yeah, I think that I used to find the soul building theodicy just really implausible, but at least as a all-encompassing theodicy. But now I've come to see that I'm still not convinced of it as the best response, but I think it has a level of plausibility to it. It's able to account for various evils, like free will. It seems to more be plausibly in regard to moral evils, but soul building can account for natural evils and perhaps hiddenness as well. And I would say that it is plausible, but okay, so a couple of objections that I have with it is that different people undergo different experiences. And like, yeah, we're all different to some degree, but we also have some similarities. And it's like, some people undergo some severe suffering while some people may die young and so on. So you have this problem of variation that if soul building is really essential and it really needs these types of sufferings, then we shouldn't see it's hard to reconcile it with all the variations. And then if you apply it to like animal suffering, that's going to raise further difficulties too. And of course, somebody like Trent Doherty, Richard Swinburne, they'll apply it to animals as well. And I find that difficult, but I suppose you could make that case. But then it's, why would God design some animals to eat others? And that raises the problem of diversity even more with soul building. But, animal suffering is, its own kind of unique problem. But so that would be one objection. And then another problem I would have with the soul building is I just don't know that the goods that soul building appeals to are actually compensating enough. Like, sure, things like courage, courage, compassion, mercy, like these things are really important, but I'm imagining in heaven, I'm not going to like exercise these as much. Maybe I will, but to me, the greatest good is being in a state of happiness and love. And I don't know that we need those other, not that they're not good, but if God has a choice, it seems like the suffering,
they're not morally significant in important ways.
Yeah, it seems like the suffering to me is worse than the compensating goods. Like those are goods, but are they good enough to balance the scale? Maybe they are from God's perspective. Maybe we just don't appreciate it enough, but it is a difficulty as well with the soul building. But another difficulty I feel like with these types of responses is that a lot of times when theists will argue these things, it's like everything, and I guess it's called meticulous providence. Everything is planned out by God. So every event has some specific reason for it. And I find that to be really implausible. And I think it's damaging to the theist case because it seems like there's a lot of events that I don't think God would have planned for. So if somebody's going to argue the soul building view, I think and I think Trent Doherty is somebody does this. You have to argue for it without meticulous providence, but rather there could be some sufferings that God didn't plan for, but it's all a part of the soul building process. Does that make sense? That distinction?
Yep. So the last theodicy I had on my list was skeptical theism. And do you, since I laid out soul building, you want to lay that one out?
Sure, yeah. So skeptical theism, as I understand it, is the idea that it's kind of the academic way of defending appeal to mystery is the way I look at it. We're just like not in a position to know God's reasons for things. His mind's infinite, our mind is finite, or because another way to phrase it is because our mind is finite, there are going to be goods and reasons outside of our scope. So, it's sort of the analogy that gets used, like a child wouldn't know why their parents take them to get a shot, but the parents understand why. So there are these reasons that are outside of the scope of our knowledge. And to me, or I guess, is that how you understand it as well?
Yeah, that's more or less how, that God's reasons, we shouldn't expect to be able to comprehend God's reasons because of the epistemic distance between our minds and his infinite mind, which is more or less what you said.
Yeah. Well, I guess, epistemic distance, that's another, well, anyways, I won't go into that, but it has its own.
Okay, please note when I throw out jargon terms like that, I always catch myself.
But yeah, my problem with skeptical theism is, I guess if I ran out of theodicies, say they fail, then that would be my fallback. But the problem I have with it is that it seems like it ends up collapsing into like a soul building theodicy. Oftentimes when I see skeptical theists presenting their case, they bring up examples like soul building or free will, and they say, and it just seems like those are the only types of goods that it's appealing to. So then I'm wondering, well, why don't you just argue soul building? And then if they're going to say, well, there's some other goods that totally fall outside of our knowledge, it just seems like an unwarranted appeal to mystery. I mean, at some level, it's like, what if I said, well, 1 + 1 = 3, and it just falls outside of our knowledge of why. And I would just say, no, that's in my knowledge. I can see that's false. So it's like, if you can't come up with anything, it's logically possible. It's not logically incoherent to suggest there's some greater good or reason, but without anything to sink my teeth into, I'm just wondering if it's basically presenting a case like that. Like, I wouldn't accept the atheist to throw out just like a non-answer or just a mystery appeal if I were to give like a cosmological argument. I see some atheists do that, and I don't accept that. So to me, skeptical theism kind of feels like that. Like, I agree that the problem of evil and hiddenness can be a mystery to some degree, but I need something more than just that I'm limited in my understanding.
And I think that's Richard Swinburne's exact approach to it. He's like, no, we need to be putting theodicies forward. And I have to figure out which one it was, but
well, providence and evil.
Yeah.
I just read it actually. So.
And so the only thing that I would add to that is another big concern for skeptical theism is that it also implies, along with it, a form of moral skepticism, in that if we can't be sure about the reasons why something is happening, perhaps this is part of some God's providential plan, and we are agitating it with our libertarian freedom or frustrating it with our libertarian free will. And so that maybe our best part is to withhold judgment altogether on certain things that we would normally take as, no, these are things that are unjustified and therefore give us some reason to do something about. Well, no, maybe it's because they're part of some bigger provincial plan that we don't know the part of, and we're not in the position to say whether or not we should do something about it. And so the best position is to just then withhold judgment altogether. That's a worry. I'm not saying that objection goes through. I'm saying that's a worry for.
Right, like the moral paralysis objection.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that I'm not convinced by that objection, but I do agree that it's a worry. Basically, I feel like that kind of hovers around my central issue with skeptical theism, that it seems like it borders on becoming skeptical about things we shouldn't be skeptical about. Like, we do recognize that there needs to be justified reasons for allowing suffering, and we may not be able to give a full account of God's, but I need more than just there could be some reason. But yeah, anyways, that's pretty much all I had.
Gotcha. So that does it for theodicies involving problem of evil. Did you have anything in particular to the problem of divine hiddenness that you wanted to go over?
I'm not as familiar with the variation of responses to hiddenness, but it seems like a lot of times.
Theodicies? Are those called theodicies? No.
Yeah, I would say you can call them that, but I don't know. Maybe they do. I don't know.
Someone
will
correct me.
It seems like a lot of times the responses are kind of similar to hiddenness as they are like for the problem of evil. I think like greater goods, like soul building type responses, or to just contest the idea that there are non-resistant non-believers, that everybody's resisting to some degree and some are resisting more than others would be.
Do you find that to be plausible, or do you think that there are plausibly non-resistant non-believers in the world?
I think it is plausible that, I do think some people are probably resistant, but see, this gets, yeah.
All parties to the discussion should be able to concede that.
Yeah. I think, but even that to me is mysterious. So we're getting into the nature of beliefs. It's something that I contemplate, how somebody arrives at their beliefs and how culpable they are. So I guess, somebody I was talking about the other day, I'm not going to pronounce it right, but doxastic voluntarism.
Doxastic voluntarism.
Yeah. So the idea that we have freedom over our beliefs, and
doxastic being belief, voluntarism being the control over.
Yeah, and I don't think that we do, but I do think we have indirect control. So, or at least I think it's plausible. But at the same time, it's like, how is somebody culpable for their beliefs? It is mysterious because I'm very convicted of what I believe, but I don't really take credit for it, and I don't blame other people. But when I see people,
it's not like you could just change your mind on a whim. You couldn't just wake up tomorrow and say, okay, well, now I just believe this.
Yeah. So I do find it plausible. I believe people when they tell me, they just can't believe, they don't find it reasonable. But at the same time, of course, there are some individuals who seem like they're not truth seeking, and that can go on both sides, of course. But yeah, I think that there probably are non-resistant non-believers, and that would be in accordance with my Catholic theology, which would grant that that's possible. So.
Gotcha.
But I do want to go back to something you said earlier about universalism. So I know that's not what our discussion's about, but I certainly find universalism to be appealing. I would say though that even if somebody, so you had raised a point, it sounded like you're saying that it would have to be, or at least it should seem like it's true in order to make up for somebody's suffering, unless that person just does not want to enter into the heavenly realm to be in relation with God, then I think that God would be justified in allowing them to go their way. Then somebody might say, well, why did he create them in the first place? And then that gets into, perhaps middle knowledge and type things. But anyways, that was just something I wanted to respond to there.
Cool. I didn't have any other material planned for this evening.
Are you guys ready for questions?
Yeah. I'm ready. Are you ready, Caleb?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Cool.
All right, great. So if anybody wants to put in your questions, you can tag me, writer John Buck, or you can tag Converse, and I'll be able to see those for him. I actually have kind of some questions of myself I was kind of writing down as I was going through, and I also have a couple from the people in the chat. Just to kind of make sure I understand exactly the argument, it's sort of a P implies not Q, Q therefore not P, where if God exists, then there would be no unjustified evils that occur. There are unjustified evils that occur, therefore God does not exist. Same for if God exists, then there would be no. What's the exact wording?
So theism implies there are no non-resistant non-theists, and then the second premise is there are some non-resistant non-theists.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, and so this might be more of a question for you, Caleb, because I was just kind of thinking about the first premise, and at least within Christian theism, which holds to both the crucifixion as well as like the Book of Job as being canon, it seems like that would be the first premise might have to be like argued for, especially or is not taken as a given. Like if it is a case that within like the canon of Scripture that there are instances of unjustified evil, such as the crucifixion of the sinless Jesus Christ, and there's also instances of, say, Job's suffering, which from his own perspective was certainly seemed unjustified and an instance of great suffering, but yet those were still, at least I don't know. Do you have an argument, I guess, Ben, for why that first premise should be accepted within Christianity, or maybe Caleb, if you agree with the premise or not?
So, I'll let you go.
Yeah, sorry.
No, you're fine.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, I agree with the premise if by unjustified we mean that it has to have some moral reason overall. So that was where I made that caveat at the beginning. If we mean that every event has to entail an immediate good for that individual, I would contest that. But some theodicies could argue that with Christ's crucifixion, that does bring about greater goods for him, and others, like soul building, or there are different things, or like the Alvin Plantinga type Felice Culpa theodicy and that sort of thing. But I would agree with the first premise that there has to be some sort of moral justification overall. I mean, even like in Job, one could argue that the immediate justification was Job coming to a greater understanding of God. Again, I'm not arguing that way, but anyways, yeah, I would agree with the first premise when it's qualified in the more general sense.
And so I would just say that I defined an unjustified evil as one that a perfect being could have prevented, so it was within their power to prevent, and they would not have been justified in not doing so. And since we already grant at the onset that God is a morally perfect being, this is the sort of thing I'm intentionally defining it as something that is incompatible with God. And that's because that's what premise A is supposed to be said. Premise A, my first premise is supposed to be saying is that theism is incompatible with this unjustified kind of evil. And so I think Caleb just did a great job of explaining that he's not going to concede that it's this ultimate incompatibility of unjustification, because that's what we're saying in the first premise, that you just can't have. And to use the modal jargon, it's necessarily true. In every possible world in which God exists, there would be no unjustified evils in any of those worlds. And if there were even one in a possible world, God would not exist in that world.
Right. So like you could define an unjustified evil as like the wrongful punishment for a crime that an innocent did not commit. And then that would entail that the crucifixion of Jesus was a unjustified evil that God could have prevented, but yet did not, indicating, I guess, that God does not exist.
That's one way, but then there's obviously the response on the other end of that. There could have been this compensating good, of which having all of these sins washed away is the compensating good or the prevention of the evil, equally bad or worse, that is achieved through the crucifixion. Do you see what I'm saying?
I see. Okay. So yeah, you could like take a utilitarian approach where if it is the case that the crucifixion of Jesus, say, like brings about salvation for all living human beings, then that could be a justifying reason.
Between the axiological and the deontological ways of trying to cash out this premise. So some people are going to think of it in axiological or consequentialist terms and say that, look, there are these things, these compensating goods that justify these sorts of things. And then there's going to be people that think in other ways and say, no, in terms of rights, I'm sure we've all, well, God would just have the right to do that. God would just have it would be categorically permissible for God to do X, Y, or Z, regardless of of consequences. See what I'm saying? So these are just two different ways of thinking about ways in which some evil could be unjustified from the perspective of a perfect being. So one of the things that I wanted to stress in my opening for listeners was there's no way to defend this premise that there are unjustified evils without making some sort of appeal to a substantive moral claim, whether it be about value or whether it be about the rightness or wrongness of our actions or about the virtuousness or viciousness of our character. You have to make some sort of...
Right. That's actually perfect, because my next question was going to be regarding the second premise, because like I'm most familiar, I guess, with the problem of evil as laid out by J.L. Mackie, which always seems a little bit confusing because he includes a premise that like a perfect omnibenevolent God would not allow any evil to exist, which seems to be something that most Christians would disagree with, given that we agree that like we have some sort of sinful nature within us, and yet God wants us to exist so that he can kind of wash us clean. But what made it particularly strange is like from J.L. Mackie's moral error theorist position, then it seems like he would have to deny, at least looking at your argument, that there are intrinsically unjustified evils that exist, because those are morally loaded terms which have no I guess, truth maker to them, or that can be cashed out at all. So I'm curious, like, given within theism, the definition of evil seems to require some sort of, most Christians accept the moral argument for God's existence, meaning that any sort of evil or moral terms has to be grounded, I guess, within God's existence. So if it is the case that we're saying that there is this thing which exists, which is grounded by is necessarily grounded within the existence of this other thing, but we're using it to prove that that other thing doesn't exist. It seems like it doesn't really hold much water. Do you kind of see what I'm getting at? Like most people say, like you can ground evil's existence or off of, say, okay. Is your definition of evil something that requires a God to exist?
No.
Okay.
So another important distinction in the discussions for a problem of evil, one being axiological and deontological ways of thinking about it. Another way is subjectivist and objectivist formulations of it. So we have to keep in mind that at the end of the day, the problem of evil is a problem within theism. So what we're talking about are premises that the theist would be committed to. And that's where the problem arises. So anyone from the outside, an atheist included, doesn't have to themselves accept any one of the premises. Because you could still, so let's imagine that someone, a theist, was a hedonistic utilitarianism, who thought that what was morally the best was the maximum amount of pleasure in the world. Well, let's then say that I'm criticizing this utilitarian theist by challenging them and saying, look, the world is not a hedonistic paradise, which is what your theism would predict. So none of my beliefs have been relevant. I'm a subjectivist in this thought experiment, but I can still point to the tension in the theist's beliefs. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, it seems like if the Christian assumes, say, like teleology, like there is an intrinsic nature to man that their wills ought to be satisfied, like if they were some sort of hedonist, and their support, I guess, their meta-ethical support for that would be God's existence, that like he imbued some sort of teleological nature within mankind for this specific end. But yet we're using the fact that we cannot achieve that end to prove that God doesn't exist. But it seems like if the very like moral nature that we're assuming requires God's existence, it seems like I don't know. Maybe
that's another question, and it's an interesting question because with the problem of evil, one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens. And so you can just switch some premises and you can say, look, yes, I accept the first premise. Theism implies there are no unjustified evils. And I also believe that God exists. So the conclusion of that is there are no unjustified evils. Why are there no unjustified evils? Because God is the ground of morality. And so, and so you can literally Morian shift this into a moral argument, which plenty of people do. And so then the interplay on since they share that first premise, since they both concede that theism implies there are no unjustified evils, the case becomes which is more plausible, that moral realism implies theism, or that there are some unjustified evils. Those would be the two. And so whoever has the stronger case, you could think of it like two scales balancing out. You'd say like, okay, here's the case for the view that theism implies moral realism, and here is the case that there are some unjustified evils. And that would, in theory, settle the disagreement between the person, like you just said, who's come to the table with the assumption that theism or moral realism implies theism, that somehow God's existence is necessary for there even to be moral truths at all.
Right. Do you want to add anything to that, Caleb?
Yeah, so something that I've thought, and maybe I'm wrong here though, is that somebody could be a moral non-realist and still put forth the argument by just saying that there's this common property or feature of charity, and the theist is going to argue that God is charitable, he cares for others. So it wouldn't be that it's a moral issue, a moral argument. It would just be saying, well, God's not exercising charity, and we know what that is. So I don't think that one would have to even be committed. Like, I don't think it necessarily needs to go down the route at all, but that's just
I see. Thought. Yeah, like you could do sort of a virtue ethicist argument against God's goodness, that he's not exhibiting that virtue to the greatest extent that he could.
Just to warn the audience too, not that anyone's done this, of the potential ad hominem here in moving away from the argument of evil and to the beliefs of an interlocutor. So just because an interlocutor is a subjectivist, their beliefs aren't relevant. And so if we then start attacking an interlocutor's subjective, more, ethical subjectivism, we've then moved from the argument at hand to the person. And that's a textbook ad hominem.
Well, isn't that basically what you're doing with the Christian? Like, you hold that God is all good, and there's these evils, like from within your own perspective, there's these evils. Even if, say, I'm a Machian moral error theorist, even if I don't accept that there's actual evils that are out there, but you would, from your perspective, wouldn't that be sort of like an ad hominem attack?
No, not because if what we've come to discuss is the rationality of theism. So in the context of J.L. Mackie, he's the discussion. The question is, does God exist, and can reason bear fruitful answers to that question? And so that's just then cashing that out. And so it's the other thing, the things outside of that then just don't become relevant. Now, if he were to then pick out a theist and start criticizing but oh, well, you see this a lot of times in debates. Well, they'll say, well, you hold to this other view, like earlier, like let's say a theist holds to a Molinist view. And you go, well, you can't defend that view because you're a Molinist. And because of that, so-and-so. That's an ad hominem. You've moved the attention was supposed to be on the argument, and we changed it to the person and their beliefs, which aren't relevant to them. And I just want to mention that because it's an easy mistake to make without even realizing you're making it. I've made it. I'll make it again.
Yeah. Okay. So there was another thing, like regarding your conception of an intrinsic undesirable evil. Would that entail like it's undesirable by all parties or only the party that is experiencing that evil?
Neither. It was, so when I say intrinsically undesirable, I mean undesirable in itself. So its very nature makes it so that our response to it should, ought, or must, or gives us some sort of reason to respond to it in some sort of way. So it's not something in an agent. So some state of affairs being intrinsically undesirable is a fact about the object. So let's think of a conscious animal burning on fire. So that would be an intrinsically bad state of affairs, not just from the first person's perspective of the thing consciously burning, but from the point of view of the universe as well. It would be an intrinsically undesirable thing. And so we would all share the same reason of, if there was a bucket of water close by, we should go over and pour it over and relieve the suffering.
I see. So it's less of a, like when I guess most people consider moral evils, they're referring to actions that have some sort of more negative moral weight to it of some sort. But this is a negative moral weight to a state of affairs rather than any sort of action. So
I think state of affairs can have moral significance, and I think that actions can have moral significance, and I think that traits of character can have moral significance. So I think, traditionally in ethics, there's three really big views. There's virtue ethics, consequentialism, and then deontological continent. And so I think all of these methods are climbing the mountain, the same mountain from different sides, and so that they'll all generally agree on what is moral. The reason they start on different sides is because they ask different questions. When we're thinking in deontological terms, we're thinking of questions that have to do with people's intentions. When we're asking questions about, consequentialism, we're thinking about the consequences of actions. And when we're thinking about virtue ethics, we're thinking about traits of character. We're just asking different questions.
Right. Okay. And I'll get back to you, Caleb, in a second. It's funny you had mentioned the Morean shift, or like one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens, because I've seen some people sort of using the fact that there is unjustified evils to make the case for antinatalism, which is the argument that it is an intrinsically immoral act to procreate life into a world where suffering will occur. Like suffering has some sort of this intrinsic undesirability within it. And so to come to exist where there is that possibility, it would be worse. So like the argument would be something like
climate change. So to have a child, so let's say for the sake of the ethical thought experiment that we know that in the next 30 years, the quality of life for human beings will be very miserable. And so the antinatalist argument would be, you shouldn't have a child because you're just bringing, you wouldn't take your child down the street to to a torture chamber. Like, so why would you bring a child into a world where they're just going to suffer for, the majority of their lives? That's roughly how the anti
Right. Something like, for people that exist, unjustified evils will possibly occur, or will actually occur. For people that do not exist, no such unjustified evils will occur. Then with the moral position that we should avoid causing unjustified evils for people. Therefore, it would be better, or we should not bring people to come into existence. Or it wasn't properly worded between there, but yeah. And then there's, I guess, the
common question in the ethical literature.
Yeah. All right. And then there's also, like, using that Morean shift. If we deny that procreation is wrong, then we could use that to say there are no unjustified evils, and then that God does exist. But of course, that's kind of, that kind of flip reversal, which I find kind of fun within the.
I always try to tell people, like you learn modus ponens and modus tollens, and you kind of look at it and you go, oh, that's, duh. It's so obvious. There's such incredibly powerful tools.
Yeah.
And when you really understand entailment relationships, and your thinking automatically starts thinking of ways to Morean shift different ways, you start seeing inferences in the world. It's an incredibly powerful tool.
Mm-hmm. All right. I had some questions for the other argument, but I do have a couple questions from people in the chat. So Mind Onion, I believe, asking a question for you, Caleb. Why would God create at all? If God is maximally perfect, then isn't God plus creation less perfect?
Yeah. So why God would create, and if it would be possible for God to create, would of course be two different questions. But my response of why God would create would be to bring other beings into relation with God. That would be something that God would want. And of course, that gets into, the nature of a perfect being's desires, or if it would have desires and so on. But that would be how I would answer why. But the second question, if God is actually perfect, then isn't God plus creation less perfect? I would say no, because something can be perfect, but then if you have something else that's imperfect, that doesn't necessarily take away from the perfection of the the first thing. I don't see how it would logically follow. But also, second of all, it's not that creation adds any perfection to God, because all the perfections found within creation are also found within the being of God. So that's how I would respond to those.
What do you mean by that? All the perfections in creation are also found within the being of God?
Yeah, so like good things. So anything you're going to point to that's good, it's going to have some sort of ontology within God as well. Now, there might be a particular, so like love, for example, we could say love is good. Well, God has love. Power is good. Well, God has power. Now you might say, well, eating an orange is good. Does God have that? Well, I would say he has the knowledge, or at least a greater good than that within himself. So he either has that good, or he has something that surpasses that good, is how I would respond.
Okay, gotcha.
I would answer it. I get a stab, right?
Yeah. Go right ahead.
So I would just say because creation was relevantly good or worth achieving for its own sake. And so that to think of perfection as being something less by adding something worth creating, I don't think that's where the problem comes in. I think the problem would come in more along the lines of, if we're conceiving of a God as an infinite, unbounded being, then how can that be separate from its creation? Does that make sense? So if we're saying that it's infinite and unbounded, how can it also, in its perfection, but then there's something separate from this infinite unboundedness? That's where I think the actual problem would come in, and that's where we would actually need more time to. But I don't think the objection of perfect being plus less than perfect creation somehow makes God's perfection less. I don't. The more, I think the better question would be, how could a perfect being create anything less than a perfect creation? Yeah, that's a better question.
All right, thank you. And we got a question from Nathaniel, I believe for you as well, Caleb. We already know that torture works very well to even force confessions from innocent people. So why wouldn't someone choose God after, say, 1,000,000 years in hell?
Yeah, so there's several different ways to approach that. Of course, not everyone holds to hell being torture.
You just assumed like we didn't even bring it up.
Yeah, well, I guess it's a relevant question, but like I don't think that hell at least is eternal torment. I would say that does seem unjust, but even so, some will argue that if hell is for beings that are just so bent on opposing God that they're going to continue to do that anyways. But you can also look at hell as kind of like the way like C.S. Lewis conceives it in like The Great Divorce, that it's not like torture, it's just a sort of apathy to God. They just refuse the relation. So there are different ways to think of hell. We don't have to think of it as people being tortured. But
Gotcha.
And the question also assumes that there's a choice that can be made within hell. So there are many Christian theological traditions that maintain that once the judgment is done, it's done. There is no, after X amount of time, I will change my mind. And so I think when I look at that question and I see that assumption already built into it, I just think the question needs to be revamped.
Right. All right. So I guess we got a let's see. Shoot. Yeah, an update, I guess, from Mind Onion, I'm asking if God has made the overall situation less perfect by creating.
Yeah.
I guess, like, if God is the only perfect thing, and then you create something that's not God, is the world less perfect now because there's this other thing that exists that's not God?
Yeah, and isn't this kind of sounds like Justin Schieber's like non-God object?
That's
argument?
exactly what I was just thinking.
Yeah, I don't think I'd have to see it broken down, but I've never been convinced of this because, first off, if God is justified in creating, then he's going to necessarily have to create something that's less perfect than himself. And I just don't see why that makes the situation any less like, I just don't see how it logically follows. But even if it did, I don't see, that would just be an ontological issue. To me, it wouldn't be a moral issue. And I wouldn't have a problem with that. So let's just say it was true that everything is lesser. Well, okay, I don't know that would make me doubt that God exists. So
Gotcha.
that's not an approach.
All right, thanks. All right, now getting back to the second argument regarding divine hiddenness. Let's see, which one do I want to start with? All right, so there's one premise. So premise one of the argument was, if God exists, then there are no people that are open and willing to having a relationship with God. Oh, wait.
Non-resistant non-theists.
Huh? Oh, huh?
So if theism is true, there are no non-resistant non-theists.
Okay, no non-resistant.
Don't believe that God exists, and that non-belief is not. They're not culpable for that non-belief.
Right. And does that have to be like in that exact temporal moment? Like, could it be the case that God desires to have a relationship with them, but God knows that if he were to go into a relationship with them at this point in time, it would be one in which they were, say, not as fulfilled by, perhaps. Like I see with some people, they like lose their theism due to the problem of evil. So if they were to believe that God exists, they would sort of adopt some sort of maltheistic belief and think that God wasn't all good and all loving. So maybe in those circumstances, God would rather not letting them know that he exists? Just, I don't know, kind of spitballing.
No, it's fair. So, because one of the crucial claims that I'm making is that God is always open to relationship. So, not that he would always pursue relationship, but just that nothing he would do would put relationship out of reach of a finite person so that they could have a relationship with God simply by trying. So, the metaphor that I really like is the light bulb, where God is like a light bulb that no matter how much his brightness fluctuates, he might seem very bright in certain moments and he might seem very, very dim or distant in other words, but no matter how much that brightness fluctuates, it would always remain on. And the only way that you wouldn't be able to see that light is if you were resisting it by closing your eyes. Gotcha. And so that metaphor, when I heard that metaphor, it just helps concepts click.
Okay. So the other instance that I guess can kind of be gone at two for the second premise. Actually, sorry. Do you want to comment on that, Caleb, first?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. For the second premise, then I was thinking. So I can imagine an instance where I can enter into a relationship with a person without fully knowing the extent of their existence. Like I could be pen pals with somebody and I can build a relationship with them, even though I don't really know that much about them. Or if maybe it's the case that this is a chatbot that I'm interacting with and I'm building a relationship with them, even though my conception of their existence is incorrect, or it may be the case that I think it's a chatbot and it's actually a person there behind that. So yeah, does the person's do they have to have a full understanding of the ontological existence of the other person in order to have any sort of relationship with them?
So I would argue yes. So I would say that there's a distinction between belief in and a belief that. So we might say that we have a belief in a person, and we might say that we have a belief that something is the case. And so I believe that in order to have a belief in something, like a belief in God, that implies the belief that God exists. So if I'm going to have a meaningful relationship, reciprocating relationship with someone like a pen pal, then yes, it is a necessary component that I believe that person exists.
Okay. And I know you guys mentioned it a second earlier about doxastic voluntarism. I guess in order to... okay, well, I'm just kind of thinking that there's the only thing we can have Cartesian certainty regarding is our own existence, and even the fact that other minds exist is something that I'm sort of having to add to or accept, sort of not necessarily on blind faith, but at least on a inducted inference. So, do you think that that having to make that same sort of inductive inference for God's existence, it would be something that would not be necessary if God existed?
I'm sorry, I don't think.
Yeah. So similar to how I have to make an inductive inference that other minds exist, would that inductive inference not be necessary if God existed? I guess if it's just this light that is kind of always on unless I close my eyes. I don't know.
I think I get what you're saying,
yeah.
John. So I think what he's getting at is, or maybe I'm wrong, but would God's existence have to be so evident that it would be like Cartesian level of cogito level of evident in order for God to be morally justified? So,
no, I think it would be the same sort of confidence that we have that there are other minds.
Okay. So interesting. Well, so I guess the second part to that then would go into the doxastic voluntarism. Do you think that people that enter into solipsistic beliefs are doing so voluntarily, or do you think that they're rationally warranted in holding? Or actually, I don't know if that's necessarily.
I'll be honest, I'm not convinced as a matter of psychological fact that someone has, in fact, embraced a solipsism view.
Interesting. Okay.
So perhaps they have. I just don't think anyone's ever really defended it in like a good faith. Like they might have, defended it for the sake of an argument or, to just see where certain ideas went. But do you know of anyone off the top of your head that's, I don't know of any.
I guess the only people I could think of are probably like schizophrenics in some sort of way. I don't know if it would be exactly schizophrenic, but then I guess they wouldn't be doing so off of a, I guess, rational basis, or there was some sort of mishap that's going on there.
For me, it's not ever really been so much a real possibility as it has been a tool for my own thinking, of a way of seeing, like, where my certain epistemic positions start, and the power of, how skepticism is this ever prevalent force that we're, constantly trying to battle over, or just as an argumentative device, in that, if you say, well, you're, as in like a reductio ad absurdum, like it would say, well, this view implies solipsism, so therefore it can't be right because that view can't be right.
Right. Yeah.
No.
All right.
Yeah, I don't know anyone that's really seriously defended it.
Okay, cool. All right, and let's see. We've got a question, I think, from Quentin Vanesh. Maybe it's already been touched on, but is reasonable non-belief possible under dry apologist's worldview? I think you kind of responded to that because that was the second premise. And
yeah, I would say that it is. Yeah, it doesn't mean that there necessarily are people who, again, I think that there probably are, but yeah, it is possible, and I think it's probably the case that there are reasonable non-believers. Yeah.
Okay. All right, and a question from Daniel Ibitsky. If the person committing the immoral action suffers no harmful consequences from their actions, is it then moral under consequentialism? I think that's more for you, Ben.
Can you post that question?
Yeah.
There you go.
If the person committing the immoral action suffers no harmful.
So sort of taking the moral luck argument, like if somebody starts driving drunk.
Two important things going on here. So there's a question about just desert. So suffers no harmful consequences. So their question says the person committing the immoral action, but then asks, is it then moral? Well, we've already judged it as immoral in the first part of the question. So I would have to know which part they want to go with. Is this a question about just desert, or is this a normative question about the wrongness of, some act based on the consequences? So the consequentialist says that what determines the moral properties are the consequences of our actions. That's what matters morally.
Right. And so the way I've heard it is, like, we typically consider driving drunk to be immoral because it can lead to accidents and injuries and wrongful deaths, things like that. For the person that drives drunk but doesn't hit anybody or hurt anybody, was that action not actually immoral? And because I guess within consequentialism,
that's moral. Yep, that's moral. Because then you're saying, because look, there weren't any bad consequences, but what they still did, their intentions were bad. So this is where consequentialism loses its force, and we're on the other side of the mountain now, and we're trying to climb up to that peak, but we're now thinking about someone's intentions. They intended to get behind a wheel and drive a car knowing that they were intoxicated, and that they shouldn't have done that. They had a reason not to do, they had moral reason not to do that, because that's one way in which you can say, look, if you're going to think about morality in only consequentialist terms, then you're going to have this moral luck problem. where someone has done something that's obviously morally objectionable, just because they didn't have bad consequences to it doesn't mean that they haven't done something morally objectionable.
But I wonder if that question meant to be phrased differently, because it talks about the person. What did they mean? Anybody, perhaps? Because I mean, it wouldn't. I'm just kind of thrown off when it says suffers consequences from their action. It says if the person committing it suffers no consequences, were they meaning to say anybody? Because I'm really thrown off by the way it was phrased, and that's where I think that's maybe what they meant, because that fits better with how we think about consequentialism. And I think that gets back to your example that I think it depends upon how you define and defend. So I don't buy into consequentialism, but it depends upon how somebody defends it, I guess.
Right. So like sort of a rational egoist or a personal hedonist sort of perspective, like, or like they're a consequentialist, but only if it affects them, something like that.
Yeah. So the way to think about it, three of the most common methods of ethics are the utilitarian consequentialist type approach, the self-interested approach, and then the intuitionist approach. So the utilitarian is saying that we should maximize everyone's well-being. The egoist is saying I should maximize my own well-being. And the intuitionist is saying, no, we should be maximizing anything. There are these absolute moral rules that we have intuitive knowledge of. Those are what determine. So those are three broad methods of ethics.
Gotcha.
All right. Rabbit hole all night. Y'all can't let me keep doing this.
Yeah. All right. I think that's all the questions we have. So I don't know. It's up to you guys if you want to do some sort of like bit of recap between each of you.
Since I gave an opening thing, so I'll let, if Caleb wants to have the final word, I'll let him do that. My voice is going too. I'm sorry. I went go-karting earlier today and I was yelling. My voice is not all there.
No, I don't have much to add. I think this was a good discussion. So thanks for doing this, Ben, and then thanks for hosting John and Converse. Yeah, and then just to plug my own channel. So I have my channel is Apologetic Showdown. So I might do a brief after show, but anyways, I host discussions every Sunday at 3, and anybody's welcome to drop by. I love talking about these things. So
great. Yeah. Thanks everybody for stopping by. I really think this was a great conversation. I love kind of like what Converse does with his channel, where he actually gets into a much more discussion type or orientation for these types of debates. I really like it. So
I live for these kinds of discussions. I had a beer and everything. It was great.
Yeah, this was great. All right. So thanks everybody for watching. Go subscribe and follow these people on Twitter. We should have the links and stuff down below. So I'll be sure to sign off then. Good night, everybody.